Hey everyone, it's Professor Clark, and in this lecture, we are going to very quickly cover about 900 years of the history of Russian literature and the Russian literary language. So, as I'm sure you know, Russian does not use Latin orthography like we do in English. It uses what's called Cyrillic, and Cyrillic has a very interesting history. In the year 862, Prince Rostislav of Great Moravia, which was a kind of mini empire in Central Europe, sort of centered around what is now the Czech Republic, asked the Byzantine Empire to send a mission to evangelize his people. The Slavs at the time were not Christian, they were pagans, but many Slavic nations were starting to become interested in Christianity as kind of a marker of being an advanced, civilized, and powerful country. And so Prince Rostislav asked Byzantium to send a mission to his people. And as part of it, it was decided to create an alphabet in order to translate the Bible into the local vernacular. And so the monks Cyril and Methodius, who were brothers from a Slavic-speaking region, were tasked with creating an alphabet and grammatical structures that could be used to translate the Bible. And they sat down and they did so. And the alphabet was called Glagolitic, from the verb glagolati, to speak. And we still have remnants of this word in modern Russian, like glagol, a verb. And the language is now called Old Church Slavonic because it was specifically used for translating sacred texts. It was based on the Slavic vernacular of Cyril and Methodius, which was probably some kind of Bulgarian sort of thing. But it was changed or modified. They actually added elements of Greek grammar in order to translate the kind of abstract concepts that you have in the Bible. So it was this kind of Esperanto-ish language that was created specifically for this purpose and was really only used for sacred texts. There were no native speakers of Old Church Slavonic. It's just this purely literary language. However, it should be said that Old Church Slavonic was used for hundreds of years after this for all kinds of church-related writing, which was most of the writing that was done, and also for official government texts. And so we do have a fairly large body of texts written in Church Slavonic of various sorts. And it was not until really the 18th century that people switched away from using Church Slavonic for their writing to using something closer to the vernacular. And we'll talk about that later. And so in 863, Cyril and Methodius translated the Gospels using the alphabet and the grammar that they had created and traveled to Great Moravia. Again, this is sort of somewhere sort of Prague-ish in order to be the mission to the Moravian people. And Glagolitic, this alphabet that they created, and you can see on the left of the PowerPoint slide, there's a icon with Cyril and Methodius, and they are holding a scroll with the alphabet that they created. And there's some inscriptions that are also in kind of Church Slavonic talking about sacred texts. And so they are saints and are venerated as saints. And Glagolitic itself, we no longer use, however. However, we use aspects of it. So it was specifically created for the sounds of Slavic languages. As I'm sure you know, Slavic languages have lots of hushers, so things like zh and sha. And so they created these special letters that would convey the sounds of the hushers with just one letter. And if you compare the Cyrillic using modern Slavic languages, such as Russian or Bulgarian, for example, they can use a single letter to convey these sounds as opposed to the West Slavic languages, which have switched over to Latin orthography, and they have to use all kinds of diacritical marks and multiple letters to convey these sounds that in Cyrillic, you just have one simple letter to convey because Cyrillic is based on Glagolitic, which was created specifically for the sounds of Slavic languages. However, Cyrillic and Glagolitic are not the same. Glagolitic sort of morphed into Cyrillic, probably starting sometime in the 10th century in Bulgaria. where the alphabet was modified and changed a little bit and became something more like modern Cyrillic by disciples of Cyril, and hence it was named after Cyril in his honor. And I'll just finish by saying that Cyrillic has undergone many reforms since then, and each Cyrillic using language has its own slightly different version of Cyrillic in order to best deal with the specific sounds of that language and the history of the, evolution of that language. So Russian has Cyrillic, which is its own form of Cyrillic, and it's slightly different, for example, from Ukrainian Cyrillic, which has a couple of extra letters. It has a couple of extra e letters that have been dropped from Russian Cyrillic. And then, for example, Serbian Cyrillic has a couple of letters like L and N, where in Russian you have to write them with the consonant plus a mjaki znak, and in Serbian they just combined the consonant and the mjaki znak into one letter that looks like a smushed up N with a mjaki znak or a smushed up L with a mjaki znak. And so we have these slightly different versions of Cyrillic for each of the different Cyrillic using languages these days, but they're all pretty similar and mutually intelligible. So if you can read one of them, you can often puzzle through the others pretty easily, and Cyrillic is quite easy to read. So it's very handy that way. And so that is sort of a quick and dirty intro to the history of the creation of Slavic literature, or the Slavic literary language, and the Cyrillic alphabet that we continue to use today. So what kind of literature was being produced in the Middle Ages in the Slavic-speaking countries? Medieval Slavic literature was heavily influenced by Byzantine literature because a lot of the Slavs had converted to Byzantine or Orthodox Christianity. And of course, the East Slavs, those who are practicing Christians, still tend to be Orthodox Christians allied with the Eastern Orthodox Church. And so the medieval Slavic peoples got their literary text, their foundational text for what literature was, from the Byzantine Empire, and so they used that as their basis and created things like chronicles. So, sort of like what happened this year in this particular kingdom, hagiographies, so saints' lives, and then sermons. And so a lot of what we have from the Middle Ages right up until like 16th, 17th century are mainly things like chronicles, saints' lives, and sermons. So expressing sort of official government or church business and written in Church Slavonic. There was also a very lively oral folk tradition, but unfortunately very little of it was written down. An interesting exception is the tale of Igor's campaign, Slova Polku Igorovye, which is the story of a 12th century military campaign that's told in this very lyrical style. And there's a certain amount of controversy over how authentic it is, but many people think that it is authentic. And it's this sort of glorious, lyrical medieval lay or song about this military campaign. Interestingly, it's a military defeat, which is an unusual thing to memorialize, but it's mainly about sort of the Slavs' relationship with nature and a warning about infighting between Slavic princes, which was a huge, huge problem in Kievan Rus, and eventually led to the destruction, basically, of Kievan Rus, but that is a story for another class. The main thing to keep in mind here is that most literature from the 10th through pretty much the 17th centuries at least were these sorts of chronicles, saints' lives, sermons, very church-oriented stuff. There was not a real tradition of written poetry or drama or anything like you had coming from England during the Elizabethan period, or even earlier with Chaucer. Russian literature, Slavic literature didn't have that kind of thing as much. And so their modern literature developed extremely quickly in the 18th century, and that is what we will turn to next. Russian literature, and we're now talking about Russian literature as opposed to more generally Slavic literature, Russian literature made this kind of huge, great leap forward in the 18th century. And just as a quick historical reminder, We're now talking about the Russian Empire. So we are transferring from medieval Kievan Rus with its close ties to Byzantium and its center of gravity being in Kiev to the post-Mongol invasion Russian Empire. It no longer has close ties to Byzantium because Byzantium doesn't exist anymore. And the center of power has moved first to Moscow and then to St. Petersburg. And so that's where we are now. And in the 18th century, first Peter and then Catherine, and really all the emperors and empresses of the 18th century, but especially Peter and Catherine, brought about this enormous shift in Russian culture in general, where they pivoted from Byzantium and the Mongols, so sort of the East, basically, to Western Europe. And one of the changes that happened was the fairly deliberate creation of modern literature, as we in the West understand it. And so they deliberately adopted Western literary forms and styles. And you can see in this picture of Lomonosov here that he's dressed like an 18th century Western European nobleman. So there was this huge change in clothing, in manners, and in culture in every way, and this huge influx of Western culture that was kind of like worked over, and they tried to do this thing called sklonение na nashi nravi, sort of adaptation for our ways, and take Western things and adapt them a little bit and make them Russian. And so people like Vasily Tredyakovsky and then Mikhail Lomonosov, again, you see his picture here on the left, and he's wearing a white wig and a red brocade coat and holding a quill pen and generally looking like an 18th century European nobleman, began creating guides and rule books for how to write in these new Western literary forms. As a side note, Mikhail Lomonosov, as much as he looks like a member of the upper classes, and by the time he was this age, he was actually originally from a working class, non-noble family up on the White Sea. He really wanted to go to college, so he walked all the way from the White Sea to Moscow, enrolled in college there, pretending to be noble because non-noblemen were not allowed to attend college. When his subterfuge was discovered, he could have been executed for it, but they were so desperate for talented young men that instead of executing him, they sent him to Germany to go to college in Germany for a few years. So he had a German degree and then came back and worked as kind of a court scientist for a while, but he also created the kind of rules for writing modern Russian poetry and wrote a bunch of examples of modern Russian poetry. And he also helped found what is now Moscow State University. So, busy guy. And some of the things that he did that basically created modern Russian literature, the modern Russian literary language and the modern Russian literary style, and that are still used in modern Russian literature today, is he combined Old Church Slavonic, which, remember, everything was written in Old Church Slavonic until then, even though no one actually spoke Old Church Slavonic. So he combined Old Church Slavonic with the vernacular style to create a literary language that was closer to how people actually spoke, but also had these elements of the high literary style of Old Church Slavonic. And you can still see influences of that in modern written Russian. And he also, and you're really going to rue the day that he did this, but you will be glad to have learned it, he also introduced the use of syllabotonic versification. And you're going to learn all about what that is in the next lecture. And so he introduced this concept of syllabotonic versification, which is still used to write a lot of Russian language poetry today. And one of the first poems that he wrote is the Вечернее размышление о Божьем величестве, the evening meditation on the greatness of God. And this was written to be an example of this new style that he thought all Russian poets should use, and which they did, in fact, use. So now you know a little bit more about how the Russian literary language was created, and you can go and enjoy reading an excerpt of Вечернее размышление.